Hi, I'm Pete Andresen with Andresen and Associates. Thanks for joining. I'm sitting here in Salinas, California, and we're dealing with an atmospheric river. Big series of rain. It's even hitting up in the Sierras and melting snow. And we're looking at flooding. Actually, the highway south of here is closed right now. And that's interesting because if I had said to you 3 years ago, gee, I'm concerned about floods, you would have looked at me like I was nuts. Well, you would have looked at me as if I was nuts if you were a normal person. And yet, historically, California is famous for its floods. In the 1860s, we had an absolutely crushing drought, which was absolutely devastating, and then an absolutely monumental flood, probably the biggest ever in the following year. So this kind of weather, historically, is normal for California. But we forget it if we go through a decade of drought, and we forget droughts if we go through a decade full of rain. I think Steinbeck wrote about that. And my point here is that we forget stuff that is historically actually normal, but actually we haven't seen for a while. So I'm reminded of that because a client sent in this newsletter from 2019, and in it there's a couple of lessons. One of them is, here's what I wrote. At some point in time, debt service will become an issue. The global economic annual output is apparently about $106 trillion today. The combined federal government debt in the world is about $255 trillion, 240% of annual global output, which is an all-time record. In other words, our current global economic boom is definitely fueled by overspending. Now picture the global interest rate going up 1%, which it could do quite easily. Remember, I'm writing this in 2019 when interest rates were essentially zero. And picture the resulting increase in global debt service expense. The central banks of the world are riding a tiger, having pushed interest rates down so far and having created an unsustainable demand for debt. They have created a great vulnerability which can only be assuaged by more debt. It's a bit like an addiction, I suppose. Well, it's happened, hasn't it? We haven't dealt with this in decades, so inflation and higher interest rates are quite new for many investors, but historically they've happened before, and we've been through this before. So one thing to think about is that it does not indicate the end of the world as we know it. This is part of what happens if you go back into the 1970s or the 1940s or the 1920s. It happens. The debt load is a giant change. That means that literally at 240% of global annual output, some nations are simply going to go belly up in terms of the ability to pay debt. Politicians of both parties in the United States haven't dealt with this at all. Nobody's dealt with this. And we don't need to be ultra frugal. I mean, it's not like we have to go out completely at the other end of the spectrum. But we are going to face a decade here where this becomes an issue. That means that there will be less growth in the future in places with too much debt. It means that there will be pension plan and Social Security issues, not catastrophic, just issues. It means that there will be social unrest. It means that there will be challenges. History tells us that this happens. So it's happening now, and we'll get through it. But the other thing that's likely to happen is that corporate refinance is likely to involve changing bonds into stock, and that means that more stock supply is going to come onto the market, which means dilution, which means that the stock market is likely to fade. So I think that Vanguard is pretty accurate. You've seen my assessments in past videos about that. So yeah, I think we're going to see an underperformance here for a little bit. Now the other thing we're going to see is more business failures. Silicon Valley Bank went under today. Again, too much debt, can't refinance at the higher interest rates, mortgages at 8%. a run on the bank and it's closed. That's likely to happen. That's likely to exacerbate things. That's why the possibility of a recession, to me, remains a genuine possibility. But there's another thing here. There's another lesson. And that is, I wrote this on December 3rd, 2019. That's before COVID stuck its slimy fingers into the game. And yet the stock market has gone up. Tell me, depends on what you're invested in, but let's say 50%, 40%. If we had gone to cash and run for the hills, we would have missed out on a 40% gain or a substantial gain. Since then, even with 2022's down market, a lot of investments have still done quite well since then. So we can see it coming, but we can never see the timing. Anybody predict this flood? You can't see the timing, and that's the challenge. That's why, even though there's plenty of things to be alarmed about, I am not taking your money ultra safe. I'm not moving 100% to cash, even if I'm wrong, because history tells us that long term we should be okay, and that short term big moves actually decrease from overall portfolio performance. So expect more turbulence. We've seen this coming for years, maybe way too early in advance, just like we've been talking about this flood for years, but you can't get the timing. So our only option really is to stay the course, stay courageous, turn off the talking heads. It's the weekend coming up. Have a nice cup of hot chocolate or whatever and enjoy having a real winter. So thanks for watching. I'm wishing all the best for you as we get through this time, and blessings.